The letter hit the floor of the Sweetwater Creek post office the same moment Mae Alden's world collapsed entirely. She had been holding it for 3 minutes before she opened it, standing there in the dry Arizona heat of late October 1882, her fingers trembling in a way she had never allowed herself in front of another living soul. The postmaster, a round little man named Briggs with wiry gray eyebrows that seemed perpetually startled, watched her from behind his counter with the cautious attention of a man who has seen too many people receive bad news in his establishment. Mae did not give him the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She read the letter twice, then a third time. The words were written in the thin, precise hand of a solicitor in Dublin, a man named Connolly who had managed her late father's affairs, and who had, until this moment, been the only person on earth who knew the full shape of her secret. The letter said 3 things. It said that Patrick Alden was dead, which she already knew, having watched him buried in the cold ground outside Cork 6 months prior. It said that his debts, hidden from Mae her entire life, were staggering. That the house, the land, the furniture, every last piece of silver cutlery she had grown up touching it was all gone, claimed by creditors who had been circling like patient wolves for years, while her father smiled and poured whiskey and told her they were comfortable. And it said that a man named Victor Hale, to whom her father had apparently pledged her future in a private arrangement she had never been consulted about, was now making formal inquiries through his legal representatives about the status of that agreement and whether it might still be honored. Mae had left Ireland on a Tuesday. She had taken every shilling she had left after the creditors swept through, which amounted to £32 and some change, converted it to American dollars, and bought passage on a ship called the Meridian out of Queenstown. She had told no one where she was going. Not her father's cousin Margaret, who would have insisted she stay and marry Victor Hale and consider herself lucky. Not the priest who had performed her father's funeral mass. Not anyone. She had spent 23 days on the Atlantic Ocean, and on every one of those days she had stood at the rail in the morning and looked at the water, and she had told herself that whatever she was sailing toward could not possibly be worse than what she was sailing away from. She had arrived in New York in September of 1882, stepped off the Meridian with her 2 leather bags and her grandmother's silver brooch pinned inside her collar, and taken the first train west that she could afford. She had no particular destination. She had a vague notion, informed by the stories she had read in illustrated papers during the crossing, that the American West was a place where a person could build something from nothing, where the ground itself didn't care what your name was or who your father had been or what arrangement some man in Dublin thought he'd made on your behalf. She had ridden the train through Ohio, through Indiana, through the flat astonishment of Kansas, through the shifting colors of Colorado, and had finally disembarked in the territory of Arizona because she had run out of money precisely at that moment. And the conductor had looked at her with something between sympathy and impatience, and told her that Sweetwater Creek was a proper town with proper folk, and she would not find herself entirely lost. The conductor had not mentioned Victor Hale's solicitor would find her even here. Mae folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked out of the post office into the blinding Arizona sun and stood on the main street of Sweetwater Creek, which was a single dirt road lined with storefronts and hitching posts, and a saloon at the far end that was already making noise at 10 in the morning. She had 34 cents. She had 2 days remaining on the room she'd paid for at Mrs. Cordero's boarding house. And now she had a solicitor's letter in her pocket that told her Victor Hale had not given up, that he had resources she did not, and that he was the sort of man who viewed a prior arrangement as a binding contract regardless of whether the woman involved had ever agreed to it. She stood in that street and let the wind throw dust against her skirt, and she thought, very quietly and very clearly, that she needed work. The man at the livery stable told her to try the hotel. The woman at the hotel told her they had no positions. The woman at the general store, a Mrs. Farquhar with kind eyes and a practical manner, told her that the only person in the county who ever needed extra hands and actually paid a fair wage was Abel Kendrick, out at the Kendrick Ranch about 7 miles south of town, but that she should be warned that Abel Kendrick was not what you'd call an easy man. Me thanked her and asked if there was a way to get there. There was a wagon going south that afternoon with a delivery of feed and fencing supplies. The driver, a sunburned young man named Tom Rays, said she was welcome to ride along if she didn't mind sitting on a sack of oats. She did not mind sitting on a sack of oats. The road south of Sweetwater Creek was more suggestion than certainty. It wandered through scrubland dotted with saguaro cactus and dusty rock formations that turned red and gold in the afternoon light in a way that me could not help finding beautiful even through her anxiety. Tom Rays told her about the country as they rode, about how the territory was changing fast now that the railroad had come through, about how the cattle business was good but hard, about how Abel Kendrick had run his ranch for 6 years alone since his father passed, and had built it into something genuinely impressive by the measure of any man and considerable stubbornness. Me asked what he meant by stubbornness. Tom considered. "He's a man who knows exactly what he wants and how things ought to be done," he said. "He's fair, he's honest, but he doesn't bend much and he doesn't talk much and he doesn't particularly trust strangers." Me looked out at the desert and thought that a man who didn't trust strangers might be exactly the right sort of man to understand why trusting strangers was sometimes a very bad idea. The ranch came into view as the light turned golden, the long, low profile of it sitting against a mesa that glowed amber in the late afternoon. There was a proper ranch house built of adobe and timber, a large barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a series of corrals in which a small herd of horses moved with easy, liquid grace. Beyond that, further than she could clearly see, cattle grazed on the scrubland. Tom pulled the wagon around to the barn, and a handful of ranch hands appeared to help unload the supplies. Me climbed down from the oat sack and brushed the dust from her skirt. "Kendrick," Tom called out. "Got a passenger with me, lady from town looking for work." There was a pause, and then a man came around the corner of the barn, and Mae Alden, who had crossed an ocean to start over and had not once allowed herself to be knocked sideways by anything since she had boarded the Meridian in Queenstown, felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Abel Kendrick was 32 years old and built like a man who worked outdoors every day of his life. He was not handsome in any obvious or theatrical way, but his face was the kind that rewards looking at. All strong lines and weather-darkened skin and dark eyes that moved with a directness and intelligence she was not accustomed to seeing in men who worked with their hands. He wore his hat pushed back on his head, and his shirt was dusty, and he was looking at her with an expression that was simultaneously guarded and curious and completely unreadable. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Tom, you're about 2 hours late. Lost a wheel spoke outside of Carrizo Flats," Tom said, beginning to help unload. "Took some time." Kendrick walked toward me. He was taller than she'd expected from the distance. He stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her with those direct, dark eyes, and she had the strangest sensation that he was reading her the way some people read weather. "You're looking for work," he said. "I am. What kind of work?" "Whatever work you have that needs doing and pays a fair wage." A slight pause. "What's your name?" "Mae Alden." "Where are you from?" "Ireland, most recently." He said nothing for a moment, studying her. "You cook?" "Yes." "You can manage accounts, records," she blinked. That was not what she'd expected. "I can. My father kept accounts for his property. I helped him from the age of 12. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "My cook left 3 weeks ago. My records are a disaster. I've got a house that's been running itself without anyone to manage it and books that need someone with a brain to sort through. I pay $20 a month and you'd have a room in the house." Me thought of her 34 cents. "I'll take it," she said. He nodded once, turned back toward the barn, and said over his shoulder, "Tom, show her where to put her bags." And that was how it began. What me did not know, standing in that dusty yard in the golden afternoon light of late October 1882, was that Abel Kendrick had his own dark past, his own hidden secrets, and that the ranch at the end of the road was about to become the center of a story that neither of them had written or intended or remotely expected. What she also did not know was that Victor Hale had already hired a man to find her. The kitchen at the Kendrick Ranch was a proper room, larger than me had expected, with a cast iron stove that was good quality, and a long worktable and shelves of supplies that were well stocked but disorganized in the way that happens when a capable person leaves and nobody steps in to maintain their system. Me spent her first morning sorting it, making inventory in the small journal she'd brought from Ireland, learning what was there and what was lacking. The ranch had 8 hired men who lived in a bunkhouse 30 yards from the main house. There was a foreman named Deke Harlow, a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and a manner that suggested he'd seen most things worth seeing and wasn't particularly surprised by any of them. He gave me a measured look the first morning and then, apparently deciding she was capable of handling information, told her how the kitchen was supposed to run, and what the men expected at meals, and what the previous cook, a Mexican woman named Dolores, had done that had kept everyone satisfied. Me listened carefully and took notes, and did not miss the fact that Harlow was testing her, watching to see if she'd bristle at being instructed by a ranch hand rather than waiting for the boss to explain things. She didn't bristle. She was grateful for useful information delivered by someone who clearly knew what they were talking about. By noon she had produced a meal that was simple and filling, and was, by the genuine reaction of 8 ranch hands, considerably better than what they'd been managing with on their own for 3 weeks. Abel Kendrick ate at the long table in the kitchen with his men. This surprised her. He did not sit apart or take a separate meal or treat the dining arrangement as beneath him. He ate what his men ate, participated in their conversation with a quiet authority that was clearly earned rather than assumed, and when the meal was over, he thanked her in a direct, unembellished way that she found more satisfying than a dozen flowery compliments. After the meal, he took her to the small office adjacent to the main room of the ranch house and showed her the books. The books were, as he had said, a disaster. But they were the kind of disaster that comes from neglect and too little time rather than from any fundamental dishonesty or confusion, and me could see the underlying structure clearly enough to know that putting them right was simply a matter of careful, systematic work. She looked at the records for a moment, then looked at Abel. Who was keeping these before? I was. When did you stop? About 4 months ago, when we went through a difficult stretch with the cattle and I couldn't keep up with everything. What kind of difficult stretch? He met her eyes. There was something in his that she had begun to notice, a quality of restraint, of things held back that were not dishonest exactly, but were private in the way that old pain tends to be private. A small outbreak of Texas fever in the East pasture, he said. We lost 32 head. It was managed, but it cost a significant amount to contain, and it took everyone's full attention for several weeks. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it. He looked at her as though he were uncertain what to do with that. It's handled, he said. The books aren't. She picked up a ledger and opened it. Then I'll get started. He left her to it. Over the following days, Mia established herself in the rhythm of the ranch with a quiet efficiency that she could feel was being noticed, and that she did not particularly perform for anyone's benefit. She cooked. She managed the kitchen. She worked through the accounts in the evenings, and twice in that first week Abel came into the office after supper and sat across from her, and they went through the records together, him explaining the transactions she didn't have context for, her showing him where the errors were and what she proposed to correct them. These sessions were businesslike and should have remained so. They did not entirely remain so. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment me could have pointed to and said, there, that is where it began. It was more like the way light changes in a room without you noticing, until suddenly you look up and realize it is completely different from what it was an hour ago. Abel Kendrick was not a man who performed charm or made easy conversation. But he was a man who listened with absolute attention when she spoke, who asked precise and intelligent questions, who never once treated her like a person of inferior mind or lesser authority simply because she was a woman and an employee. He disagreed with her on 2 accounting matters in that first week, and on both occasions he stated his disagreement plainly and listened to her counterargument with the same genuine consideration he would have given a partner. And on one of those occasions he told her she was right, and on the other he walked her through his reasoning until she agreed he had a point. She found him, against everything she would have preferred, deeply interesting. She found herself paying attention to things she had no practical reason to notice. The way he moved through the kitchen in the mornings when he came for his coffee before anyone else was up, quiet and contained, like a man who had learned early that the world is best approached carefully. The way he handled the horses, with a patience and ease that struck her as fundamentally revealing of character. The rare occasions when something caused him to laugh, an actual laugh, brief and genuine, not the performed variety, and how it changed his entire face. She told herself firmly that she was here to work, that she had come here with one purpose and one purpose only, which was to build enough stability and enough financial reserve to ensure that Victor Hale and his solicitors could never reach her. That entanglements of any kind were precisely the opposite of what she needed. She told herself this every morning. On the 6th evening of her time at the ranch, she was sitting in the office working on the accounts when Abel came in and set a cup of coffee on the desk beside her without being asked, then sat down in the chair across from her. She looked at the coffee, then at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He opened the ledger he'd brought in and studied it for a moment. Then he looked up. "You said you came from Ireland most recently," he said. "Where before that?" She set down her pencil. "Ireland for all of my life until this September. I was born in Cork." "What made you come here to Arizona specifically?" "I ran out of train fare at Sweetwater Creek." Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. "And before that, what made you leave?" She was quiet for a moment, measuring what to say and what not to say. "My father died," she said. "And the circumstances of his death revealed that the life I had thought I was living was not entirely what I'd believed it to be. It seemed like the right moment for a significant change of geography." He looked at her steadily. "The circumstances of his death," he repeated. "Debts," she said, "and an arrangement he had made without my knowledge that I had no intention of honoring." A pause that was longer and more careful than a simple gap in conversation. "An arrangement," he said. "A man in Dublin thought my father had pledged me to him. He was mistaken, but he had resources and I did not, and putting an ocean between myself and his lawyers seemed like the most sensible available option." Abel was quiet for a long moment, looking at his coffee cup. "Did it work?" he said. Mae reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out the letter that had arrived at the post office in Sweetwater Creek, unfolded it, and set it on the desk between them. He read it. He took his time. When he was done, he folded it back along its creases and set it down, and his expression had changed to something she could not precisely name, something that was simultaneously cautious and quietly furious on her behalf in a way that he was clearly not going to voice directly. "This was waiting for you when you arrived in Sweetwater Creek," he said. "Yes. This Hale, what kind of man is he?" "The kind who believes that a prior arrangement creates an obligation regardless of whether the other party was consulted. The kind who has enough money to hire solicitors and investigators and who does not take being refused graciously. Have you heard from him directly, not through lawyers?" "Not yet." The yet sat between them. Abel folded his hands on the table. "You're safe here," he said. It was not a declaration or a promise made lightly. It had the quality of a thing he was committing to without drama, the same way he had said, "I pay $20 a month," like a statement of simple and binding fact. Mae looked at him for a moment. "I'm not asking for your protection," she said carefully. "I am quite capable of managing my own situation." "I know that," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." She picked up her pencil and returned to the accounts. But she found, for the first time since she had boarded the Meridian in Queenstown, that the fear she had been carrying, the cold, tight thing in her chest that had become such a constant presence she'd forgotten what it felt like without it, had loosened just slightly, like a knot given a small amount of slack. November came in cold, with nights that dropped to temperatures Mae had not expected in the desert and mornings that were shockingly beautiful. The sky a shade of blue that had no Irish equivalent, and the light falling at angles that made everything look simultaneously ancient and brand new. She had settled into the ranch with an ease that might have surprised her if she'd allowed herself to think too carefully about it. The work suited her. She had always been a person who needed things to do, who found shapeless days more exhausting than busy ones. And here there was always something that needed doing, and always the satisfaction of seeing it done. The ranch hands had grown comfortable with her. Deke Harlow had become something like a friend, in the careful way that men of that type develop friendships, through competence recognized and consistently demonstrated. There was a young hand named Roberto, only 20, who had grown up on a ranch in New Mexico, and who had a habit of lingering in the kitchen after meals to talk about things he clearly couldn't talk about with the other men, and Mae had developed a quiet affection for him. And there was Abel, who she saw every day and who remained both utterly present and carefully, deliberately held at arm's length from anything resembling vulnerability. She learned things about him not from direct conversation, because he did not volunteer information about himself, but from the accumulated evidence of how he lived and worked. She learned that he had come to Arizona from Texas when he was 26, following his father who had bought this land and started the ranch with everything he had. She learned that his mother had died when he was 19, and that this had done something to him that had not entirely healed. She learned that he was known throughout the county as a man of absolute honesty, that his handshake was considered as binding as any legal document, that he had twice helped neighboring ranchers through difficult periods at considerable cost to himself, without making any large display of it. She learned these things from other people, from Tom Rays, who delivered supplies, from Deke Harlow, who occasionally revealed things with the careful indirection of a man who admired his employer and wanted that understood without sentimentality. She learned very little from Abel himself. This was not coldness. She had known coldness. She had grown up in the house of a man who was warm to everyone and honest with no one, including himself, and she knew what coldness dressed up as warmth looked like from the inside. Abel Kendrick was not cold. He was contained, which was entirely different, and she was beginning to understand that the containment had causes she had not yet been trusted with. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, Mae was in the kitchen long after supper, making preparations for the following day's meals, when she heard riders approaching the ranch at a speed that was not casual. She went to the window. 3 men on horses were coming up the road in the dark, moving fast enough that the sound of them had traveled ahead. The ranch hands were already beginning to emerge from the bunkhouse, and Abel came out of the main room door with a lantern in one hand. Mae watched from the window as the riders pulled up in the yard. She recognized one of them. He was a heavy-set man in a suit that was expensive and completely wrong for the territory, a city suit, with a watch chain that caught the lantern light. She had never met him personally, but she had seen a likeness of him in a newspaper portrait her father had shown her once, in the casual way of a man showing off a connection he was proud of. Victor Hale had not sent a solicitor. He had come himself. Mae stood in the kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she untied her apron, folded it on the table, and walked to the kitchen door and out into the yard. Abel was already talking to the men, or rather, was standing with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of active resistance. He had not invited them down from their horses. He was holding the lantern and looking up at the three of them with an expression that was completely neutral and somehow significantly more threatening than anything angry would have been. Victor Hale saw me emerge from the kitchen door and smiled. It was a smile she immediately despised. "Miss Alden," he said, "what a remarkable journey this has been." Me stopped 6 feet from Abel and looked at Hale with every bit of the composure she had refined over 3 months of carefully refusing to fall apart. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you have traveled a considerable distance for nothing." "I don't think so." He looked around the ranch with the evaluating gaze of a man accustomed to calculating the worth of things. "I had no idea you'd find something so established. Good instincts as always." "There is no arrangement," Me said. "Whatever my father told you, whatever he wrote or signed or agreed to, he had no authority over me in that matter and no ability to make a binding commitment on my behalf. I am not an asset that can be transferred." Hale's smile did not change. "Your father was very clear." "My father was very many things," Me said, and heard the edge in her own voice and did not soften it. Clarity was not consistently among them. "I don't honor that arrangement. I have never honored it, and I will not." A pause. Hale looked from me to Abel, who had still said nothing, who was still holding the lantern and being absolutely and entirely still. "And who is this?" Hale said. "Abel Kendrick," Abel said. "This is my ranch." "And what is your relationship to Miss Alden?" A pause that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. "She works here," Abel said, "and she is under the protection of this property." Hale studied him. Whatever he saw, he apparently decided that further pressing tonight was not strategic. He pulled his horse back slightly. "I'll be in Sweetwater Creek," he said to me. "I hope you'll think carefully about the practicalities of your situation, Miss Alden. Your father's debts don't disappear simply because you've traveled a great distance." "My father's debts are not my debts," Me said. "And I suggest you consult a lawyer who will tell you that plainly, because any lawyer worth his fee will." Hale looked at her for a long moment, and the smile faded into something more honest, which was considerably less pleasant. Then he turned his horse, and the three of them rode back down the road toward town. The yard was very quiet for a moment after they left. Deke Harlow, who had been standing off to one side with 2 other ranch hands, said quietly, "You need us to do anything, boss?" "No," Abel said. "Go on." The hands dispersed. Me stood in the yard and watched the darkness where the riders had disappeared, and she became aware that her hands were trembling, not from fear exactly but from the particular exhaustion of holding yourself together in a confrontation and then releasing it afterward. Abel stepped up beside her, not touching but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold night air. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then more honestly, "I will be." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll be back," he said. "I know. What do you want to do about it?" Me looked at him. There was something in the question and the asking of it that undid her more than the confrontation with Hale had. Not what do we do, not here is what you should do, but what do you want to do? "I want to make sure he has no legal standing," she said. "Is there a lawyer in Sweetwater Creek worth speaking to?" "Yes, Martin Graves. He's honest and he knows territorial law." "Then I'll go to town tomorrow." Abel nodded. "I'll take you." She looked at him. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. He went back inside. Me stood in the yard alone for another minute, looking at the stars, which were extraordinary out here in a way that she had still not gotten used to. An absolute unqualified multitude of them in the black Arizona sky. Then she went inside too. The following morning they rode to Sweetwater Creek together, Abel driving the small buggy he kept for town trips, me sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap and the letter from Connolly, the solicitor, in her pocket. The morning was cold and the desert had its dawn colors on, all pale gold and soft rose, and neither of them talked much for the first part of the journey. It was Abel who broke the silence. "I want to tell you something," he said without preamble, in the way he had of approaching difficult subjects by simply walking directly at them. She waited. "I know something about being in a situation where someone has made arrangements that involve you without consulting you," he said. "Not the same kind, but something similar." Me turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. My father borrowed money from a man in Texas before we came out here, he said. A significant amount. He used this ranch as collateral on a debt he never told me about. When he died 2 years ago, I discovered that I had signed papers as co-owner of the ranch that, according to the man holding the debt, made me equally liable. The man's name was Farrell. He wanted the ranch itself in settlement. A pause. What happened? Me said. I spent 8 months fighting it in territorial court. Martin Graves is the lawyer who helped me. He found a flaw in the original document that Farrell had hoped no one would look at closely enough to find. The debt was settled for a fraction of what Farrell claimed I owed, with property I sold from the eastern pasture, and the ranch remained mine. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. My point is, he said, that Martin Graves is very good at finding things people hope no one will look at closely. Me was quiet for a moment. And your point is also, she said carefully, that you understand what it is to have someone else's choices become your problem without your consent. A very slight pause. Yes, he said. The rest of the ride passed in a silence that was different in quality from the silence at the start, warmer and more settled, like two people who have told each other something real and are comfortable letting it rest. Martin Graves was a thin man of about 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the manner of someone who has spent decades sorting the legitimate from the fraudulent, and has developed a considerable talent for the distinction. He read Connolly's letter, asked me a series of precise and intelligent questions about her father's arrangement with Hale, about what documents, if any, existed, about what me herself had known and when, and then he leaned back in his chair and took off his spectacles. What your father allegedly agreed to, he said, is not enforceable under any law I know of in Ireland, in England, or here. A parent cannot legally bind an adult child to a marriage contract, particularly when that adult child had no knowledge of and gave no consent to the arrangement. The question is whether Hale has something signed by your father that he might attempt to use in some other manner, to claim damages, for instance, on the grounds of a broken promise of consideration. What would that mean practically? Me said. It would mean he could potentially pursue you for money your father may have accepted from him as a gesture of good faith, if any such exchange occurred. Do you know of any? Me thought. Her father had been, in the year before his death, uncharacteristically flush with money for about 3 months. She had not questioned it. She had been relieved by it. She told Graves this. He nodded slowly. That is a potential complication, he said. It depends on the amount and on the original terms. But even so, Miss Alden, a woman in your position is not without recourse. You are in the Arizona territory, not in Ireland. Hale's ability to compel you to anything here is essentially non-existent. His practical options are limited to pursuing a civil claim through the courts for any money exchanged, which would be a long and expensive process with an uncertain outcome, particularly if you can establish that you were not party to the original agreement. She wasn't, Abel said from the chair beside her where he had been listening without speaking. She said so. Graves looked at him. Her testimony to that effect would need to be heard in a proceeding, he said, which takes time and costs money. What does it cost to retain you to handle this? Abel said. Me turned to look at him sharply. That's my concern, she said. It's not a gift, he said in that direct and unhurried way. I'll take it out of your wages. Consider it an advance. She looked at him for a moment with something she was not prepared to name. Then she looked back at Graves. What does it cost? The number was less than she'd feared. She accepted Abel's advance and they shook hands with the lawyer and walked back out into the Sweetwater Creek Main Street. Victor Hale was standing outside the hotel across the road. He saw them emerge together and his expression went through something rapid and unpleasant. Abel noticed. Me noticed Abel noticing. They walked to the buggy. Abel helped her up in the manner of someone who has simply decided this is what he is doing and is not making a demonstration of it. They drove out of town without looking back. After a mile, me said, "Thank you. You're welcome. You should know," she said, "that I intend to pay back every cent of that advance. I am not in the habit of being beholden to anyone. I know that, he said. It's one of the things He stopped. Me waited. He didn't finish. But she had heard the beginning of the sentence, and she turned it over carefully for the rest of the drive home. December settled over the ranch with a cold that was dry rather than damp, nothing like the wet bone chill of Cork winters, but demanding in its own way. Me had by now entirely organized the kitchen, brought the accounts into clear and accurate order, developed a working relationship with every man on the ranch, and established what she could only describe as a home, which was a word she applied very carefully because she had learned from experience that comfort can become a trap. She had also, despite her best efforts, fallen considerably further in mutual whatever this was with Abel Kendrick than was strictly sensible. It was not conducted in any dramatic fashion. They did not declare things. They did not have charged conversations in the moonlight or make speeches. What happened was quieter and more persistent than that, the way water shapes stone not by force, but by unceasing patient presence. He began leaving her coffee in the mornings before the rest of the ranch woke up. She began saving a piece of whatever she baked for him specifically. When she worked late on the accounts, he stayed up, sometimes reading, sometimes doing small repair work, not in the same room necessarily, but near enough that she was aware of him, and she had come to understand he was aware of her. They talked, increasingly, about things beyond the practical. About Texas, where he had grown up, which he described with the careful detachment of a man who has warm feelings he has not quite given himself permission to express. About Cork, which she described for him one evening with a detail and a texture she hadn't allowed herself since leaving, and found to her surprise that she could describe it without grief, or with only a manageable amount of grief, which was its own kind of progress. He told her about his mother one evening in the second week of December, sitting in the office after supper with the lamp low and the wind outside doing something theatrical against the adobe. She was from Georgia, he said. She came west with my father when they were first married, and she never entirely made peace with the distance from everything she'd known. She wasn't unhappy, I don't think, but there was always a part of her that lived elsewhere. I understood it better than I let on. I was just a boy. Me looked at him across the lamp. Do you think she was glad she went? She said. I think she was glad she had my father, he said. And me, eventually. Whether the geography was what she'd have chosen on her own, I can't say. Me thought about this. I think sometimes where you end up matters less than what you find when you get there, she said. He looked at her steadily. What have you found? He said. It was a question with weight in it, and they both knew it. More than I expected, she said, which was as close as she was willing to get, and she could see by his expression that it was as close as he'd expected, and that it was enough. The trouble with Victor Hale came to a head on a Friday morning in the third week of December. Me had gone to the chicken coop before breakfast to collect eggs, a task she had taken on herself simply because it needed doing, and the morning air at that hour was something she had come to love, the absolute still of it, the way the cold made everything precise and immediate. She came around the side of the coop and found a man she didn't know standing in the yard. He was not one of Abel's hands. She knew all of Abel's hands by sight. This man was stranger's dressed, city dressed under a rancher's coat that didn't fit him right, and he was looking at the main house with an evaluating interest that raised every hair on the back of her neck. "Can I help you?" she said. He turned. He was younger than she'd expected from the bearing, maybe 25, with a face that was professionally pleasant in a way that meant nothing. "Looking for Miss Alden," he said. "Mae Alden. Who's asking? I'm a representative of Mr. Victor Hale." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He'd like you to have this." Me set down her egg basket and took the envelope. She did not open it. "Tell Mr. Hale," she said, "that my attorney in Sweetwater Creek is handling all correspondence related to his claims. Any further communication should go directly to Martin Graves." The man blinked. Mr. Hale thought a personal message might be more persuasive. "It won't be," me said. "Please leave this property." A pause. The man assessed her and apparently concluded she meant it. Mr. Hale also wanted me to convey, he said, with a quality of delivered message that told her it was memorized, that he has been in communication with contacts in New York who are aware of certain letters your father wrote before his death. Letters which contain statements that Mr. Hale believes could significantly affect your reputation and your ability to secure respectable employment. Me felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the December morning. Her father. What could her father possibly have written? She did not show any of this. Good day, she said. The man left. Me stood in the yard holding the envelope for a long moment. Then she opened it. It was a letter from Victor Hale in his own hand, which was florid and self-important and took considerable words to say what could have been said in a sentence. The substance was this. He had letters from Patrick Alden written in the year before his death that described, in detail, the private arrangement between Hale and Alden. In those letters her father had apparently stated that Me was aware of and had agreed to the arrangement. If this letter could be entered as evidence in any proceeding, it would suggest that Me had knowingly and willfully broken a binding agreement, which would expose her not only to a civil claim for damages, but to a degree of public embarrassment that would make her current employment difficult to maintain. Her father, it turned out, had lied about her consent in writing. She was still standing in the yard when Abel came looking for her 20 minutes later, because breakfast should have been started, and he had a habit now of knowing when something was wrong before he had any specific information to suggest it. He came around the corner of the coop and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched his face as he read it and saw the things that moved across it, anger and something protective and something else that he folded back before she could name it. "Your father wrote that you agreed to it," he said. "He lied," she said. "I never agreed. I never knew, but proving that Graves can handle it." "Graves can try," she said. "But Abel, this is—" She stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name directly to his face, and they both noticed it, but this was not the moment for that. "This is a document written by my father saying I was aware and consenting. My father is dead. I can't question him. I can't produce contrary evidence because I didn't know the arrangement existed, and so I have no correspondence that refutes it." He handed her back the letter and looked at her for a long moment. "Come inside," he said. "I want to tell you something." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he had of organizing what he wanted to say before he said it. "During the fight with Farrell over the ranch," he said, "there was a document that Farrell produced that seemed to prove my father had made a specific representation about the property's value. If true, it would have established fraud on my father's part and given Farrell legal grounds far beyond the debt itself. What happened? Graves examined the document and found that it had been altered. One number changed, but the alteration was subtle and might not have been detected by someone who wasn't looking for it specifically." Me stared at him. "You think Hale may have altered or fabricated your father's letters," she said. "I think a man who travels from Ireland to Arizona over a woman he has never actually had a legitimate claim to is not a man who is above fabricating evidence when it suits him," Abel said. "I think Graves should see those letters. And I think he should look at them very carefully." It was a reasonable possibility. It was also, she realized, not merely strategic wisdom. It was a man who had been through something similar trying to give her the benefit of his experience, and the care with which he was doing it was almost more than she could absorb at present. "What if they're genuine?" she said. "What if my father truly wrote exactly that?" "Then we deal with it truthfully," Abel said. "We establish by every other available means that you had no actual knowledge or agreement, regardless of what Patrick Alden put in a letter to Victor Hale. Your father's letter about you is his statement. It is not your statement. And a court and a jury, if it comes to that, will need to consider why a man in significant debt to another man might write letters that serve the interest of his creditor." Me looked at him. "You've thought about this quite a lot," she said. Yes, he said, a pause. Why, she said. He met her eyes and the answer was there, entirely clear in the way he looked at her. Because it matters, he said. You matter. Me put her coffee cup down very carefully. Abel, she said. I know, he said. You're not in a position for, I know. I'm not asking for anything. I wasn't going to tell you to stop, she said. The silence that followed that was the kind that changes things. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, one of his large, warm, work-roughened hands, and then he took it back. Let's get Graves on this today, he said. She nodded. And they did. Graves was, as Abel had suggested, thorough. He requested through proper legal channels that Hale produce the original letters for examination. Hale's territorial attorney, a man from Tucson, objected and delayed, and otherwise performed the dance of someone who does not wish their evidence too closely examined, which Graves noted in his own correspondence with a dry precision that me was coming to deeply appreciate. Christmas came to the Kendrick Ranch in the way that things came to the Kendrick Ranch, practically and without excessive ceremony, but with a genuine warmth underneath. Me made a proper dinner with everything she'd been quietly planning for a week: roasted beef and cornbread and sweet potato pie, and a gingerbread that came out better than expected given that she was improvising from what was available, which was not identical to what she'd have had in Cork. All the hands stayed for dinner. Deke Harlow, whom he had realized months ago was fundamentally kind under his weathered exterior, produced a fiddle from somewhere and played for an hour after the meal, and Roberto danced with an enthusiasm that made everyone laugh. Abel sat at the end of the table and watched his ranch full of people and food, and sound with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was unguarded in a way that was clearly not habitual. Like a man who has been alone long enough to forget what it looked like to be otherwise and is now remembering. He caught her watching him and didn't look away. She didn't either. Later, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was mostly cleaned, he came in while she was finishing and said nothing, simply picked up a dish towel and dried the things she'd washed, which was so unexpectedly domestic and so perfectly in keeping with who he had revealed himself to be that me had to concentrate very carefully on the pot she was washing in order to maintain any kind of composure. When they were done, he said, "This is the best Christmas this ranch has had in at least 4 years. Because of the gingerbread," she said. "No," he said. She turned around and he was close, having moved without her tracking it, and he was looking at her with that directness that she had stopped trying to interpret indirectly and was now simply taking straight. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said, which answered a question he hadn't quite asked, but he understood it. He kissed her. It was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. There were no fireworks and no music beyond the wind outside the kitchen window. It was quiet and very certain, and entirely right in the way that things are when two careful people who have been paying close attention finally stop being careful, and just arrive at where they've been heading all along. When they separated, she looked at him and said, "I've been wanting to do that since approximately the 3rd week of November." He smiled, an actual full smile, which she had seen perhaps 4 times and which transformed his face in a way that she found physically difficult not to respond to. "I've been wanting to do it since approximately the 4th day you were here," he said. "You have excellent restraint," she said. "I've been told it's both a strength and a significant flaw," he said. She laughed. He looked at her laughing with an expression of simple and evident happiness that she felt in the center of her chest. The new year came in while the matter with Victor Hale was still being worked through the territorial courts. Graves had successfully required the production of the original letters. The examination that followed, conducted by a document specialist he brought from Tucson at Abel's expense, and Me's insistence that this would also be repaid from her wages eventually, revealed what Abel had suspected. 2 of the 4 letters produced by Hale contained text that had been added to existing correspondence in a different ink. Not dramatically different, not visibly different to an untrained eye, but different enough under proper examination. The letters had been altered. Victor Hale had taken real letters from Patrick Alden and added sentences that were never written. This was fraud. It was not the kind of fraud that was difficult to prosecute in a territorial court, particularly when the man prosecuting it had a competent lawyer and no particular reason to be generous. Me sat in Martin Graves's office in late January of 1883 and heard the results of the examination and felt the long exhalation of several months of held breath. "What happens now?" she said. "Hale has been formally notified," Graves said. "His attorney has responded in a manner that suggests he is reconsidering the wisdom of continuing this pursuit. The document fraud creates serious legal exposure for him. Pursuing you further risks making that exposure worse." He paused. "My honest assessment is that he will withdraw. A man in his position in Ireland with social standing and business interests cannot afford a public proceeding about document fraud in an American territorial court. The story alone would damage him considerably at home." Me looked at her hands. "He thought I had nothing," she said. "He thought I was alone and far away and had no resources and would simply capitulate." "Yes," Graves said. "He was wrong." "Considerably," Graves said. She paid Graves's fee with money she had been carefully saving from her wages for this purpose, added it to the growing total she was tracking of what she owed Abel for the earlier advance, and rode back to the ranch in the mid-morning light thinking about how different everything looked from 2 months ago. Abel was in the East Corral when she arrived, working with a young mare that had been difficult since she was brought in. He saw me come in through the gate and vaulted the corral fence with a casual ease that she observed with appreciation and came toward her, reading her face. "Well," he said. "He's going to withdraw," she said. "The document fraud exposure gives him no good options." Abel let out a breath. Then, without particular ceremony, he put his arms around her and held on, which was the most sustained physical contact they had managed and was so exactly right that me pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and let herself stay there for a moment before pulling back. "That's done then," he said. "That's done," she said. He kept his hands on her arms, looking at her. "Good," he said. "I have something I want to talk to you about. When you're ready." She looked at him. "I'm ready now." He appeared to consider how to approach what he wanted to say. She waited. She had learned that he thought before he spoke and that what came out when he was ready was worth having waited for. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook, not as the person who manages the accounts." As he paused, "I'm not a man who finds these kinds of words easy to come to." "I know that," she said. "I'm asking if you would consider marrying me," he said. "If it's too soon or too much or you're not ready for that, tell me plainly and I will understand and nothing between us will change. But I want you to know that it is what I want. You, here, for the long term." Me looked at him in the late January light with the desert around them, and the horses moving in the corral, and the life she had not expected spread out in every direction. She thought about Cork, about the gray sky and the green fields and the cold stone of her father's house, and the life she had been slowly suffocating in without quite realizing it. She thought about standing at the rail of the meridian on 23 different mornings and telling herself that whatever she was sailing toward had to be better. She thought about a ranch at the end of a dusty road in Arizona and a man who had given her coffee and asked what she wanted to do and kissed her on Christmas evening in the kitchen with the certainty of someone who had been paying attention. "Yes," she said. He released a breath and then smiled, that full, real smile, and pulled her back in and held her in the warm January sun. "Good," he said into her hair. "That's very good." They were married in Sweetwater Creek on the 15th of February, 1883, in a simple ceremony at the small Methodist church that had been established 2 years prior, and whose minister was a practical man named Reverend Boyd, who did not require elaborate preparation, and whose words over them were brief and genuine. Mrs. Farquhar from the general store was there, and Tom Rays, and Deke Harlow in the only clean shirt he appeared to own. Roberto had picked wildflowers, which was absolutely his character, and had arranged them in a jar with an artlessness that was more touching than anything professional would have been. Martin Graves came and shook Abel's hand, and told me she was the most impressively organized client he had ever had. Mae wore her grandmother's silver brooch pinned at her collar, because it was the thing she had brought from Ireland that was genuinely hers, not her father's or anyone else's, and because the woman it had belonged to had been, from everything Mae had heard, the sort of woman who took life as it came and made something strong of it. Abel looked at her all through the ceremony with an expression that she could not describe adequately, but that she knew she would remember with total clarity for the rest of her life. When it was done and they were outside in the February afternoon, Mae said to him quietly, "I need you to know something." "Tell me," he said. "I came here to start over," she said. "I had no particular plan for what that meant. I had nothing, essentially. I was alone and I was frightened, though I was not going to show it to anyone. And I want you to know that whatever I expected to find at the end of that road, it was not you. You were not part of any plan I had." He looked at her. "And," he said, "and I am more grateful for that than I know how to say," she said, "that the thing I didn't plan for turned out to be the thing that mattered most." He cupped her face in both his hands, there in the street of Sweetwater Creek in the February sun, with Reverend Boyd and Deke Harlow and Roberto and Mrs. Farquhar looking on. "You came to the right place," he said. "I did," she said. He kissed her, and someone behind them made a noise that was probably Roberto, and it didn't matter at all. Spring came to the Kendrick ranch with everything spring brings to the desert. Explosions of color from plants that spend the rest of the year waiting patiently, the return of warmth that is not yet the punishing heat of summer, and a quality of possibility that Mae had come to associate specifically with this landscape, as though the country itself was constantly in the process of becoming. Life at the ranch had changed and stayed the same in equal measure. Mae still cooked and managed the accounts because she was good at it and because it mattered to the running of the place, and because, as she had told Abel in one of their clearer conversations about the arrangement of their life together, she did not intend to stop being useful simply because she had changed her last name. Abel had laughed at that, not the brief, dry almost laugh, but the real one. "I would not dare suggest it," he said. "You would not survive suggesting it," she said pleasantly. There was more money now, because the accounts were in proper order, and Mae had found 3 places in the ranch's annual spending where the cost could be reduced without affecting quality, and had found a buyer in Tucson for the higher grade of their cattle at better prices than they'd been getting from the nearest market, which required some correspondence she managed with a thoroughness that Abel observed and did not interfere with. There were more horses, because Abel had expanded the breeding program in the spring in a way he'd been wanting to do for a year and now had the financial stability to attempt. The young mare he'd been working with when Mae came back from Graves's office with the news about Hale had turned out to be remarkable, and there was genuine interest from several quarters. Deke Harlow stayed on, because Deke Harlow had been part of this land long enough to be considered part of its furniture in the best sense. Roberto was offered a promotion to a junior foreman role that he accepted with the specific mixture of pride and terror that Mae found deeply endearing. On a morning in late April, Mae was in the kitchen before dawn doing the early preparations, and Abel came in for his coffee, and she turned from the stove and said, without prelude, "I believe I am expecting a child." He stopped with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth. She watched him absorb this. His face went through something she had not seen before, an unguarded flood of something so large that for a moment he simply stood there with it and she waited. Then he set the cup down very carefully and came across the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with an expression that she thought she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. "Are you well?" He said. "Perfectly," she said. "When?" "I think November, possibly late October." He kept looking at her. "Abel," she said, "you don't need to look as though you've been struck by lightning." "I feel somewhat as though I've been struck by lightning," he said. She laughed. He pulled her into his arms and held on, and she could feel against her the particular quality of a man containing something enormous. "I know I said I didn't plan for any of this," she said against his chest. "But I find that I am extraordinarily glad about this one." "So am I," he said. "So am I." Summer on the ranch was work and heat and long, beautiful evenings when the temperature dropped and the sky did its extraordinary things, and me moved through it with the sense of a woman who has found her footing so completely that even the hard days had a different quality. She wrote a letter to Dublin, not to Connolly the solicitor, who she never wished to hear from again. She wrote to a woman named Bridget who had been her closest friend in Cork, and who had known me's father, and had wept at his funeral, and had watched me leave for Queenstown with an expression of fierce grief, and the practical good sense not to try to stop her. Me wrote and told Bridget everything. The train and Arizona and the ranch. She told her about Victor Hale and what had happened with his fraudulent letters and how Martin Graves had handled it. She told her about Abel, carefully, and with what she recognized as a degree of tenderness she'd have been ashamed to show anyone in the version of herself that had boarded the Meridian. She told her about the child who was coming. She said that she had crossed an ocean to start over and had found that starting over was not, as she had feared, simply a matter of outrunning the past. It was a matter of building something new, something that belonged to you, something made of actual choices rather than inherited circumstances. She said she was happy. She had not written those 3 words about herself since she was young enough to not understand how rare they were. Bridget's response came 2 months later, full of exclamations and questions and the particular warmth of a long friendship that can withstand geography, and ended with, "I always knew you were going to be all right. I always thought the world better watch out for Mae Alden." Me showed the letter to Abel. "Mae Kendrick," he said. "Both," she said. "I think I'll keep both." He looked at her. "Good," he said. "You earned both." October came, and with it, the first considerable cold of autumn, and on the 23rd day of October in 1883, in the bedroom of the Kendrick Ranch house, me delivered their first child with the assistance of the doctor from Sweetwater Creek, who had ridden out that morning, and the moral support of Deke Harlow, who waited in the main room for 8 hours without complaint. It was a boy. Abel, who had been present for the whole ordeal with a steadiness that the doctor commented on afterward, held his son for the first time with the specific careful terror of a large and capable man suddenly holding something that requires a different kind of capability entirely. "He looks like you," me said from the bed, exhausted and clear-eyed. "He looks like a person who has strong opinions," Abel said, which was entirely accurate given the volume the baby was producing. "What should we call him?" me said. Abel looked at the boy in his arms. He had thought about this, she knew. He had not brought it up because he was not a man who made unilateral decisions about things that belonged to both of them, which was one of approximately 100 reasons she had married him. "Callum," he said, "if you're agreeable. My mother's father was named Callum. He was a good man. She spoke of him her whole life." Me looked at the baby, who was currently studying his own fist, with an intensity that suggested he had inherited something from at least one of his parents. "Callum Kendrick," she said. "Yes, that's exactly right." Callum Kendrick grew at the pace that children grow, which is to say too fast for the people watching and exactly right for the child himself. He was a person of strong opinions from the beginning, which was accurate, and of considerable curiosity about everything on the ranch, which became a matter of requiring careful management once he could walk. Abel with his son was one of the things in me's life that she filed away to take out and look at privately on occasions when she needed to be reminded of what genuine goodness looked like in practice. He was patient in the way that he was patient with the horses, with a quality of attention that was neither soft nor anxious, but simply present and reliable. Callum, at 1 year old, had already developed the habit of following his father around the ranch at a determined totter, and Abel matched his pace without making it a performance. The ranch grew. The horse breeding program became a significant part of the business, because Abel had a talent for it that had apparently been waiting for the proper resources to become evident. Me expanded the accounts to accommodate the new operation, corresponded with buyers in Tucson and Santa Fe, and eventually as far as Denver, and managed the administrative side with an efficiency that Deke Harlow once described, in a moment of unusual loquaciousness, as like watching a clock that always tells the right time. Roberto became the ranch's foreman at 23, by which point he had grown from an earnest boy who brought wildflowers to a wedding to a capable and confident man who managed 12 ranch hands with a combination of genuine authority and genuine warmth that reflected well on everyone who had influenced his development. Me thought sometimes about the woman who had stood in the main street of Sweetwater Creek with 34 cents and a solicitor's letter, and the particular quality of determination that comes from having no alternatives. She thought about her with a kind of affectionate recognition, the way you regard a version of yourself who was doing the best she could with what she had. She had not expected, standing in that street, to find a home. She had not expected to find a partner whose silences were companionable rather than frightening, whose directness was a form of respect, whose version of love was not possession or performance but the simple ongoing act of showing up and being exactly who he was. She had not expected Arizona at all. But here she was, and here was Callum sitting on the kitchen floor banging 2 spoons together with an expression of profound self-satisfaction, and here was Abel coming through the door at the end of an afternoon with dust on his coat and stopping to tousle his son's hair and look across the kitchen at me with a look that had not changed in quality since Christmas evening 2 years prior. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. "The Henderson mare foaled. A fine colt. Roberto handle it all right. Better than I would have at his age." She turned back to the stove. He came to where she was standing and stood beside her for a moment in the comfortable way of 2 people who have learned each other's spatial presence like a language. "Me," he said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him. It was the first time he had asked that directly, and she understood that he was asking it directly because he was a man who asked things directly when they mattered enough. "Yes," she said. "Completely." He nodded once, with the satisfaction of a man receiving exactly the information he needed. "Good," he said. She reached up and touched his face briefly, the way she had come to do, and he turned his head slightly into her hand the way he always did, which was what she privately considered the most purely tender thing about him. In the summer of 1885, Me discovered she was expecting their second child. This one arrived in February of 1886, on a night when the desert was doing something remarkable with stars, and the air had that cold, clear quality that made everything look etched. A girl this time. They named her Rose Bridget Kendrick, the Rose for something the Arizona desert had given me that she hadn't expected, which was the knowledge that beauty grows in unlikely places, and the Bridget for the woman in Cork who had known me her whole life and had been smart enough to let her go. Callum, at 2.5, received his sister with a suspicion that graduated over the following weeks into a possessive affection that everyone found exhausting and sweet in equal measure. Abel with a daughter was a different thing from Abel with his son, and equally worth watching. With Callum, there was the ease of shared language, the ranch and the horses and the practical world. With Rose, there was something that had no words, something in the way he held her and the way she looked at him, and the way the whole of his formidable presence simply softened in her vicinity without his appearing to notice. Me noticed. She noticed everything about the life she was living, which was the right instinct to have, she thought, in a life that was genuinely worth noticing. Martin Graves retired in 1887 and sold his practice to a younger lawyer named Pittman, who was competent and trustworthy, and whom he worked with on the formal legal organization of the ranch's expanded operations, bringing the breeding program under proper legal documentation, and ensuring that everything was clear and recorded in a way that would never leave Abel or his children in the position his father had left him. She thought about that sometimes. About how the patterns of one generation either get handed down or get broken, and about how breaking them is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just paperwork done properly, and accounts kept honestly, and choices made with both eyes open. She wrote that in a letter to Bridget, who wrote back and said she had always known me had the makings of a philosopher and a rancher both, and wasn't it just like the universe to put her somewhere she could be both at once? On an afternoon in September of 1887, Me was in the office working on the quarterly accounts when Callum, who was 4.5 and had recently developed an alarming ability to appear places without warning, came and climbed onto the chair beside her and looked at what she was writing. "What's that?" he said. "Numbers," she said. "What do the numbers say?" "They say that this ranch is doing well," she said. "Which means your father works hard and makes good decisions and has good people around him." Callum considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who is also, it must be said, already demonstrably his mother's son. "And you," he said. Me looked at him. "And me," she said. "Yes." He nodded as though this had been established and climbed down and went to find something else to examine with his perpetual and exhausting curiosity. Abel appeared in the doorway a moment later. "Did he bother you?" he said. "Not at all," she said. "He wanted to know what the numbers said." Abel leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with that expression she had long since stopped trying to catalog and had simply started accepting as one of the best things in her life. "What do they say?" He said, "They say we are doing very well," she said, "as a matter of fact. Because of you," he said, "considerably. Because of us," she said, "as an equally correct matter of fact." He smiled. In the autumn of 1888, a letter arrived from Bridget. It said that she was coming to America. It said she had saved for 3 years, that she had a cousin in San Francisco she planned to visit, and that she intended to pass through Arizona on her way and stay for a month if Me would have her, if she was not too important or too busy with her ranch and her husband and her children and her life that had turned out better than either of them had dared hope. Me read this letter at breakfast and began to cry, which surprised her and alarmed Callum and made Rose, who was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, ask what was wrong in a tone suggesting she was prepared to solve it. "What is it?" Abel said. Me handed him the letter. He read it, looked up. "She's coming," he said. "She's coming," Me said. He looked at her with a gentle directness. "You've missed her." "Every day," Me said. "I just didn't always let myself think about it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Bridget arrived in November of 1888 on the afternoon train into Sweetwater Creek, and Me was on the platform when the train pulled in, and when Bridget came off the steps and saw her, both women covered the distance between them at a pace that was undignified and entirely appropriate. Abel, who was waiting at a polite distance, watched the reunion with the quiet attention he gave to things that mattered. When Me finally stepped back and introduced him, Bridget looked at Abel Kendrick for a long moment with the assessing gaze of a woman who has known her best friend since childhood and has therefore extremely high standards. "You're the one who said she came to the right place," Bridget said. Abel looked at Me, who looked back at him. "I did say that," he said. "And was it," Bridget said, "the right place?" He looked at Me with the full weight of everything that had accumulated between them, the coffee in the mornings and the accounts and the confrontations and the Christmas kitchen and Callum and Rose and all the ordinary extraordinary days. "As far as I can tell," he said, "it was the only place." Bridget looked at him for another moment. "Good," she said. "You'll do." Me laughed. Bridget's month extended to 6 weeks because the children would not release her. Callum had found in her an audience for his observations about the world that was both uncritical and genuinely enthusiastic, which was a combination he found irresistible. Rose had decided that Bridget was her personal property. Abel, after a slightly cautious beginning, seemed to find in Bridget a person he could talk to without having to perform any version of himself that wasn't real, because Bridget was quite clearly the opposite of impressed by performance and entirely interested in substance. The night before Bridget left for San Francisco, Me sat with her in the kitchen after everyone else was in bed, with tea and the last of a cake that had been under assault from Callum for 3 days. "Tell me honestly," Me said. "Tell you what honestly. What you think, all of it." Bridget looked at her for a long moment. "I think," she said, "that you are the most yourself I have ever seen you. I think you are living inside a life that was genuinely made for you, which is a thing that most people never find." I think that husband of yours looks at you the way a man looks at something he knows he's lucky to have, and has the intelligence to not take for granted." She paused. "And I think that your father, whatever else he was and whatever terrible choices he made, would be absolutely astonished by you, possibly in awe." Me looked down at her tea. "He always thought I needed managing," she said. "Looking after, he thought I was not capable of." "He was wrong," Bridget said simply. "As he was wrong about a significant number of things, but he was right about one thing." "What?" "He was right that you were worth considerable effort," Bridget said. "He just directed that effort in entirely the wrong direction." Me laughed quietly and wiped her eyes. "I crossed an ocean," she said. "And I ended up in a kitchen in Arizona with my best friend and a piece of callum-damaged cake." "In a kitchen in Arizona with your best friend and a piece of callum-damaged cake and a life you actually chose," Bridget said. "There is a difference. The years passed in the way of years that are full, quickly when you are inside them and with great apparent depth when you look back." Callum Kendrick grew into a boy of 7 with his father's directness and his mother's capacity for analysis, and a combination of both that his teachers in Sweetwater Creek found either remarkable or exhausting depending on the week. He had an early and serious interest in the horses that was clearly not a phase, that settled into something real and knowledgeable in a way that made Abel quietly proud in the manner of a man who does not wear pride visibly, but has it thoroughly. Rose grew into a person of relentless warmth and considerable stubbornness, which me recognized as her own in a form she found both familiar and instructive. Rose at 5 had opinions about everything from the organization of the kitchen to the proper way to approach a difficult horse, most of which, it had to be said, were not wrong. In the spring of 1890, me had their third child, a boy they named Thomas Patrick. The Patrick was a deliberate choice, and Abel understood it without being told, which was the kind of understanding that 6 years of real marriage produces. It was not an endorsement of Patrick Alden's choices. It was an acknowledgement that me had come from somewhere, that her origins were not only shadow, that the man who had failed her had also, at some points and in some ways, loved her. She could carry both things. She had learned that. Thomas Patrick Kendrick was, from his first weeks, a different temperament from either of his siblings. Where Callum was intense and Rose was forceful, Thomas was easy, a child of remarkable equilibrium who seemed to move through the world in a state of fundamental acceptance. He slept through his first night in a ranch that was rarely quiet and woke up the following morning looking around with an expression of benign curiosity that made Abel say he was the most sensible person on the property. By 1892, the Kendrick Ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the territory. Abel's horse breeding program had produced animals that were being sold to buyers in 5 states. Me's management of the accounts and the business correspondence had ensured that every transaction was clean and documented, and that the ranch's reputation for absolute reliability in dealings had never wavered. Deke Harlow retired at 60 with enough money to live comfortably in Sweetwater Creek, which he did, showing up at the ranch 2 or 3 times a month on no particular schedule, and sometimes working a half day simply because he didn't know how not to. Roberto ran the operation with the easy confidence of a man who has grown into his authority honestly, with his own crew of hands and a management style that had Me's organizational influence and Abel's fundamental values running through it like a structure. Me turned 38 in September of 1892, and Abel turned 42 a month later, and they celebrated both with a dinner that Me made and Callum declared his favorite of all time, which he said every year, and which she suspected was genuine every time. After dinner, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet with the October night outside, Abel and Me sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the chairs they kept there for this purpose, with the stars doing their Arizona excess above them. "I want to ask you something," Abel said. She looked at him. "Are you satisfied?" he said. "Not happy, I know you're happy, I've asked that. Are you satisfied with the life? with everything that it is and everything that it isn't. I want you to answer me honestly. Me looked at the stars for a moment. When I left Cork, she said, I was not running toward anything specific. I was running away from the absence of choice, from a life where every significant thing had been decided by someone else and I was simply expected to occupy the space they designated for me. She paused. What I have here is the opposite of that. Every significant thing in my life is something I chose or that I chose to keep after it arrived. You, this ranch, these children, the work I do here, all of it. She looked at him. So when you ask if I'm satisfied, yes, more thoroughly than I have words for. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Did you doubt it? She said. No, he said. I just wanted to hear you say it. She shook her head at him, which he accepted with equanimity. Abel, she said. Yes. You said that to me, the day I arrived. You said she had come to the right place. I remember. Did you mean it then? Or were you just trying to reassure someone who clearly needed reassuring? He turned to look at her with the full directness that had been one of the first things she'd noticed, and one of the last she'd ever stopped being glad about. I meant it, he said. I didn't know yet exactly what it would look like. But I looked at you standing in that yard, and I knew that whatever was supposed to happen here, you were part of it. It wasn't logic. It was just certainty. You had certainty about me in the first 5 minutes, she said. You didn't say 3 words to me. I didn't need to, he said. I looked at you and I thought, there is a person who knows what she is and what she's worth and is not going to let the world convince her otherwise. And I thought this ranch could use more of that. Me laughed. The stars wheeled overhead in their astonishing Arizona multitude. The ranch, she said. And me, he said. The ranch and me both. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it in both of his the way he always did, with that quality of careful certainty that was entirely him. They sat there for a long time while the night did its slow work and the desert breathed around them. And Mae Kendrick, who had been Mae Alden, who had been a woman with 34 cents and a solicitor's letter, and an ocean of distance between her and everything familiar, felt the full settled weight of a life that was entirely, completely, undeniably her own. In the years that followed, Sweetwater Creek grew, the way frontier towns grew when the railroad had properly arrived, and the territory was moving toward statehood, which came eventually in 1912, long after the children were grown and the ranch had passed certain things to the next generation. Though that was still far in the future in 1892, plenty of future ahead. What was not in the future but present and real and entirely accounted for was this: a ranch at the end of a road in Arizona, where a woman who had crossed an ocean to start over had started over more thoroughly and more completely than she had dared to plan. She had not planned any of it. She had simply arrived at the right place at the right time and been brave enough, when it counted, to stay. And the man who had told her she'd come to the right place had been right in every way that mattered, which was the characteristic result of a man who measured his words carefully and only said the ones he meant. Callum Kendrick learned to run the breeding program before he was 15 and had taken on a formal role by the time he was 20. Rose Kendrick went to school in Tucson when she was 17 and came back 2 years later with a degree in education and the confident posture of a woman who has had her abilities confirmed by sources beyond her parents. And she taught school in Sweetwater Creek for 30 years and was considered the best teacher the county had produced. Thomas Patrick Kendrick, the easy one, became a veterinarian, went to study in Denver, and came back to practice in the territory, which meant that the Kendrick horses had in-family medical care, which Mae pointed out was extremely practical. She told Bridget all of this in letters. Bridget had married a good man in San Francisco in 1891 and sent me a letter about him that was 3 pages of fond characterization and ended with, "He is nothing like I expected and everything I needed," which Mae found deeply satisfying. The grandchildren came eventually, Callum's first, a son he named Abel II, which caused Abel Kendrick Sr. to go quiet for a full minute and then shake his grandson's hand with a solemnity that was genuine and complete. Mae watched this and said nothing, but she kept the picture of it for the rest of her life in the place where she kept the other things worth keeping. On a morning in the spring of 1895, Mae was in the kitchen very early, before the house was awake, in the hour that had always been hers, the first hour of light and the coffee, and the particular quality of an Arizona morning that she had loved since her first year at the ranch, and had not stopped loving through every year since. She heard Abel's footstep on the stairs, that particular step she would have known in any room in any darkness. He came into the kitchen. She handed him his coffee before he'd reached the counter. He took it and stood beside her and looked out the window at the morning. 12 years, he said, since you brought me out here in Tom Ray's wagon, she said. 13 now, since I told you that you'd come to the right place. She looked at him. Do you ever regret saying it? She said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had not changed in the fundamental way that mattered, the directness and the intelligence and the thing underneath that was always warmth, even when everything else about him was quiet. Never, he said. Not once. She leaned against his shoulder. The morning came into the kitchen through the window, all gold and blue and exactly itself. The way Arizona mornings were. The way they had been every morning of this life she had built in a place she had not chosen and could not now imagine having missed. She had crossed an ocean. She had arrived with nothing. She had found everything. And the rancher at the end of the road who had said she had come to the right place had meant it the way he meant all things, completely and without reservation, and had spent every year since making sure it was true.